What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 182. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I have a lot to cover on today's show, including Assange's extradition appeal. The U.S. is looking to overturn the lower court's denial of that extradition. This is a war on journalism, it's a war on the First Amendment, and I'll be breaking all of that down. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, and right now at the Institute, we're holding our fall fund drive. We've actually already surpassed 50% of our goal, so help us finish up and round out the funding that we need to continue to produce the great work that we do. Of course, Scott Horton put this great institute together, and founding member Sheldon Richmond, and of course, Pete Quindonas and myself were brought along. And we also host podcasts by Keith Knight, Patrick McFarlane, Tommy Solomons, and we have great writers including Hunter DeRennis, Lori Calhoun, and frequent guest of this show, Connor Freeman, who has another great article out at the Institute this past week. So be sure to check out what we're doing at the Institute. When you see stuff you like there, hit the donate button. If you donate over $100 right now, that will get matching donations. And Scott says we have those donations pouring in. So do what you can, help us out, and keep this show, the Institute, and all the great stuff that we're doing there growing. You can also find the show at YouTube, Odysee, and Rumble for video versions. Of course, the last episode of the show, I was only able to put the full version up for the video either at the Institute, Odysee, or Rumble. It was just too hot for YouTube. They would have immediately taken it down and maybe even gotten rid of the channel. So think about subscribing to the show at one of those platforms. You can also find the show on any of our social media accounts, Facebook, MeWe, or Twitter. And then to directly support the show, we take donations at Patreon, Subscribestar, and then there's crypto, Bitcoin Cash. The information's in the show notes page. Thank you so much for everybody who's either supporting the show through the Institute or just directly on Patreon. Also want to take a minute to talk about the show's sponsor, the great Paloma Verde. They sell the high quality CBD products that you absolutely need. A little bit of anxiety, a little bit of insomnia, a little bit of pain. Some of the stuff that you could do to help out is taking some products from Paloma Verde. They have soft gels, extracts, tons of topicals I absolutely love. Their sports cream. So whatever you got going on, there's probably something that can help you at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Use the promo code PEACE. That saves you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. Now let's get into the show. So we have two breakdowns here from Kevin Gosztola, who shadowproofed The Dissenter, previous guest of Conflicts of Interest. It is one of the most just consistent and detailed observers and reporters of Assange's extradition case, and so his breakdowns have been absolutely essential. If you're not already, follow him on Twitter. He does Twitter threads anytime there's any Assange stuff going on in court. That's really invaluable. It's the next best experience to actually being there or watching yourself. So it's really great to check those out. But then he writes up great articles, and so this first one he has was from day one of the appeal hearing, and day one was the day where the UK, their crown prosecutor, who is acting on behalf and represents the United States government. So the UK government is working with the US government to make the case in UK court to get Assange extradited to the United States. And the guy's name is James Lewis. Now, what they are arguing is that I guess something like more of a district judge, Vanessa Bretzer, ruled initially that while Assange did violate the law, and terrible ruling on First Amendment grounds, absolutely atrocious what she did, ended up ruling against the extradition because of Assange's mental health. It would make it likely that he would involuntarily commit suicide because of the horrific conditions of the American prisons. And so that was her initial ruling. And what the U.S. and through the Crown Prosecutor is doing here is arguing that the judge ruled incorrectly, and this is because she put too much weight, or at least in part, what she did incorrectly is she put too much weight on one of us, the psychiatrist for the defense, and I'll break down kind of his testimony in that later. But the U.S. Through the Crown prosecutors also arguing here that they should have been given an opportunity by Judge Baratzer to, when she thought, oh, the prison sentences are too tough, she should have came to them and said, hey, can you do anything to make it so I could extradite Assange? And they say, oh, well, we'll make these guarantees so you feel comfortable that he won't kill himself. Now, we'll get into all this a little bit more. Just a couple notes on the hearing itself. Initially, I believe this is from Edward Fitzgerald, who's Assange's, I think, main defense attorney, says that Assange will not be attending because he's not feeling well due to his medication. Not sure what medication they have him on. Just from my personal experience working in the U.S. mental health field with people who were in and out of prison, one of the really tough things if you have mental health is prisons really restrict the kinds of medications that you could take. And so let's say you're on an antipsychotic that works really well for you. Well, that prison might say, yeah, well, we don't allow people to take that antipsychotic here. And so you have to switch to maybe something that's less effective, has different side effects. These are really tough changes that people often have to go through in prison. Also, just the kinds of anti-anxiety meds or sleeping meds that could be offered to somebody in prison, at least in the U.S., are very limited, and it's typically not the very effective ones that they allow into the prisons. And so my guess is that it's generally similar in the UK, and that Assange could be getting, not be getting the medication he needs because of the court system. Now, I also understand that Assange has some kind of autoimmune disorder, and while he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, consumed quite a bit of bone broth to help with that, very high nutrient. And of course, just with medication, the nutrition of meals in prison is fairly limited to really poor, and so that could be just other parts of what's going on here. But anyways, that was what the I believe it's somebody on Assange's side said. Now, then Assange shows up to court about an hour later, and people could see him. He says he doesn't look well. I don't know if aloof is the right word, but just just maybe isn't feeling well enough to really comprehend what's going on. So he has maybe his hand on his face, kind of just resting there and stuff like that. Now, his partner, Stella Morris, the mother of his children, said that originally he was denied by the court to attend. Now, another thing is, and I know this was the case with his initial trial for his extradition, I'm sure it's the case here as well, that because he's held in the Belmarsh prison in the UK, which is sometimes referred to the UK's Gitmo, not only because of they hold their terrorists there, but also because of the harsh treatments in the prison. Now, maybe it would be better to call it the UK's Florence ADS, which is a horrific prison. But you had to go through strip searches, right? Somebody has to see and potentially, touch your genitalia anytime you come and go from the prison, maybe even at times your cell. And so that's quite intrusive, quite humiliating, hard things to go through. And, that may explain part of the reason I'm not wanting to be at all these hearings, not, feeling well, is just, having the anxiety and the knowing that this is going to happen to you, this unfair, inhumane treatment has to be absolutely horrific. One thing that Kevin Gostola noted is that there were, in general, more mainstream journalists actually attending via the video feed. He highlighted Michael Iskoff, who recently reported, people say he broke the story. That's not really true, but at least he broke into the mainstream, the reporting that the CIA was planning in part to assassinate Julian Assange. So it's, I guess, not surprising to me that Iskoff was on this, especially because his reporting does come up. I think that's mostly they'll on day 2, so we'll get into that in a few minutes. So as I kind of said before, the two overall things, I guess, this, like the two clusters, I think there's a total of like kind of 5 baskets of appeal here, but kind of the two groups of them would be that they should have been consulted and that they were now offering a guarantee that Julian Assange would not face two things: special administration measures, SAMs, or AD at Florence, which is basically SAMs all the time. This is 23 and a half hours a day in your cell. This is really not being able to communicate with anybody. All of your communications monitored. No physical interaction, really, all this kind of absolutely terrible stuff, that the absolute inhumane, torturous U.S. prison conditions, which is essentially being in solitary all the time for the rest of your life. So they're saying they're guaranteeing that they're not going to do this, which is completely absurd. If the UK extradites Assange, the US would absolutely put him in any of these facilities, even for whatever guarantees, even if it's not any concern that Assange is going to do anything. Now, here's my concern. I think this is way too technical of an argument. Whether he's in SAMS or AD at Florence, at any prison he goes to, they could just put him in solitary confinement indefinitely, or just with like COVID protocols and quarantines and all that, they could just so heavily restrict where he's able to do and go and how many people he could see, what kind of prison population that he's in. I imagine it could be absolutely horrific. Now, one thing the U.S. has also floated was once he was convicted, he would be able to serve out the rest of his sentence in Australia, but I'm not all that certain that would put Assange in any better of a situation. We see Australia is very tight, a very central player in the U.S. empire, and so if the U.S. wants to apply some pressure on Australia to put Assange in horrific prison conditions, I wouldn't really be surprised by that. So that's one real issue. I think the Assange team did a pretty good job. It seems like they, just kind of said that this is nonsense and that you can't, have the idea that you could just guarantee, the U.S. could guarantee and you could trust that. And then the other thing that they wanted to really object was that Judge Feretzer put too much weight on the expert testimony of the Assange psychiatrist Kopelman, who said there was a very high risk Assange would commit suicide if he went to the United States, not because of some like kind of narcissism or something like that, but rather because putting somebody on the autism spectrum, as Julian Assange is, somebody who's depressed, somebody who has all these issues, as Assange has, in the U.S. prison system, the just likeliness that somebody is going to involuntarily commit suicide because their life is so terrible and miserable and torturous, and you will do anything to escape the purposelessness. They're not torturing him for information, they're just doing it to make him feel absolutely terrible. By doing that, it is making somebody likely to kill themselves, and that was essentially his argument. Now, the main crux of this is that in his initial report, Kopelman didn't include that Julian Assange had a romantic relationship with Stella Morris, somebody on his legal team, and that he had fathered 2 children, right, through Stella Morris. And there's several problems with making this argument. One, the U.S. side already knew it. They had spied on Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy for years, and while maybe they afforded themselves some privacy by pitching a tent in the Ecuadorian embassy. What do you think? What the CIA couldn't put together that Assange was going into a tent with a woman, and then 9 months later she was coming around the embassy pregnant, and her children were coming, and Assange was, I'm sure, affectionate with his children. All of this stuff had to be very obvious for the level of surveillance that the CIA had through UC Global in the Ecuadorian embassy. And so it's just stupid to make this argument, right? It's just saying that, I guess they're trying to maybe say it shows some kind of bias that Kopelman has for Assange. Now, again, through my experience working in mental health, and again, this is in the US, so maybe there's a little bit of a difference here. psychiatrists would have discretion on what kind of information they need to disclose to a court, and people have a right to privacy to what they disclose to their psychiatrist. And so it's not obvious that a psychiatrist would absolutely have to disclose this kind of thing, especially as we see through the reporting originally, like through the Gray Zone and Foreign Press, and then of course through Yahoo and Michael Iskoff more recently, that there was a threat to the life of Julian Assange and people around him. And so it isn't completely like absurd that, he would have some reservations here. Also, if you're just assessing the risk that Julian Assange would commit suicide in a U.S. prison, it doesn't necessarily, I think, make a clear impact one way or the other, whether this would make him more or less likely to kill himself. It could actually be, being separated, knowing he's not going to get to see his children as their formative years as they grow up, at the very least, if not forever, maybe actually a motivating, make it more likely that he kills himself. And so from that perspective, it really doesn't, change that he could be on the autism spectrum or not. Maybe there's some underlying stereotyping here, stigma towards people on the autism spectrum, that somehow they couldn't feel love and affection and it wouldn't hurt them to be away from their family or something like that, which of course is absolute garbage and untrue. Also, one thing to bring up on that, being somebody who was a part of the mental health community and worked in the field for 7 years, and I'm aware of all these organizations, and they advocate for people in the United States who have autism spectrum disorder, and who are put in all kinds of unfair conditions. This seems like American with disabilities issue, maybe NAMI or autism speech or something like that, may want to weigh in here and say, like, hey, it's not right to put somebody with these conditions in these places, because it's even more torturous than it would be for somebody who doesn't have these developmental disabilities, something that you are born with. It's simply that your brain is wired differently. And that's definitely something that I think should be considered. And along with like First Amendment type groups, you would hope that eventually at some point these groups do come to the aid of Julian Assange, as now he is one of the most prominent people in the world on the autism spectrum. That's definitely something to consider. One of the most influential people in the history of journalism, and certainly one of the most influential people in this century, is on the autism spectrum. There, something very interesting about that, but yet there's really no activism or support from Assange coming at all from that community, and maybe some of that should really start to be considered. So anyways, that is, I guess that's like the main part of their argument. Now, one important thing that happens that Kevin Gostola outlines in his article is actually Kopelman wasn't sure what to do and wanted to consult with a legal team, like, hey, how actually do I handle this situation? Because it's not clear if I need to incorporate this or not. And I could say that, at least as like a psychiatric team, like these are questions that that would be discussed in team meetings, like what would we have to disclose in court about our client, because what is and isn't relevant, what did you learn from the privileged relationship that you have with this person as a psychiatrist. They also point out that Assange disclosed, I believe in 2020, to the U.S. Expert psychiatrist that he did have 2 children, and also that this was filed, I guess, in early 2020, February 2020, as a part of Assange's seeking bail, to be released on bail. Having close family nearby, is having kids and stuff like that keeps people from fleeing bail, so that's like a part of something that you can include if you're seeking bail, to be able to bail yourself out of jail, right? But that wasn't granted. So the U.S. definitely knew this is a completely irrelevant argument, but yet is something that they're going to try to use, because what they want is the, I guess, high court to reevaluate the decision that Judge Bretzer made, but rather than placing a lot of weight on the testimony of Kopelman, they say not to discard him completely, but to put zero weight on what he said. So essentially, discard it completely. Now, day two was the response from the Assange team, and I got Gastola's article up here. It seems that the Assange team took a lot of time to talk about the Yahoo article, and I understand why so on this show, when we initially talked about this article, I was like, this is the deep state reporting on something that had already been well covered and known in the independent media. But what they were doing was including a whole bunch of Russiagate propaganda wrapped up in it, right? And so, I don't like that article. However, I understand and appreciate what the Assange legal team is doing by using this so heavily, because when you're talking about mainstream reporters like Michael Iskoff, mainstream sources like Yahoo News, it's a lot harder for the judge to just go, oh, what's the gray zone? And then the other side to go, well, there's claims of like anti-Semitism or supporting Russia or supporting Putin from the gray zone, and all the prosecution would just line up all those smears, and they can't even do that with the Yahoo article. So I think it was powerful to bring it up, although I'm not sure how much of an impact it really has on the arguments at hand, but maybe that's me misunderstanding the UK legal system somehow. Something I think more important that the defense brought up and highlighted was the CMUs that the United States have. These are communication management units, and this is where Daniel Hale currently is. And so Gastola actually has this great article that I ran as the Spotlight at antiwar.com one day last week called "Imprisoning Drone Whistleblower in Isolation Unit May Jeopardize U.S. Appeal in Assange Extradition Case," where Gastola goes through where Hale is being kept. I think it's in Marion, Illinois, in this prison where essentially he can't have any communication. No, his mom comes to see him, right? His mama comes. She can't give him a hug. He calls his mama. He can only have 2 15-minute calls a week, and they have to be scheduled ahead of time, and there has to be an FBI agent listening in on the call. And let's say that FBI agent just either wants to be a dick on that day or actually forgets about it or whatever, then his call is canceled. And so that's the communications management unit. And this is, something that Assange could face in the United States. Now, just think about how stupid this is in the case of Daniel Hale, right? This is a guy who leaked these documents, 5-6 years before there was ever a trial against him, before he was ever put in prison. He was out on bail for a good chunk of the time before he was actually sentenced and sent to jail. And when he was, when his bail was rejected, it's because, some psychiatrist narked and said that he was worried Hale was going to take his own life, not actually that Hale was in any way gonna do anything that would require his communications to be monitored. And so this is just absurd and stupid that you have Hale in this, and it's clearly vindictive, just like having the Vault 7, the likely Vault 7 leaker in ADF Florence. This is just vindictive, and it shows the way the U.S. Bureau of Prisons will operate and treat Julian Assange should he be extradited to the United States. So I think Gastola's argument here and what he points out is really important. Poor Daniel Hale, who's in these terrible conditions. But if him being in that condition could help make an argument for Julian Assange, we should absolutely do that. And at the same time, try to get Daniel Hale out of those horrific conditions himself. I believe if you're in that condition too, if you send Daniel Hale a letter or something, the FBI is reading everything that you send, and they have complete discretion on whether they give him that information or not. And so just treating people in absolutely horrific ways. And again, Daniel Hale is somebody who they let make a documentary about drones after he blew the whistle on the drone program, and then years after that is when they actually go and prosecute him, and now they throw him in communications management unit. So I think that's pretty important. Um, Assange's team does a good job, kind of explaining why the judge made the decisions that she made and everything like that. And actually, that while the U.S. and other experts, psychiatrists that were brought up in relation to Assange's extradition case, also found that he had depression and all these other kind of mental health stuff going on. I'm not sure they actually conclude he was on the autism spectrum, but it's not like they were like, oh, he's faking it or something like that. So that's another reason to really give a lot of credit to the Kopelman testimony. So one last thing I want to do before I move on from Assange is talk about Caitlin Johnstone's great article, titled "From Press Freedom to Prison Systems, Everything Assange Touches Gets Illuminated." And I'm not going to go through and break down the whole article. I already spent a little bit more time than I planned on this today. But what she's talking about is that Assange is such an important figure that whether it's talking about journalism and explaining how the First Amendment works and protects everyone who's publishing information, not just who ever the government happens to label as a journalist, whoever's privileged enough to work at CNN. No, we could all be journalists. I'm a journalist, and if somebody gives me information, I'm allowed to report on that. The U.S. government can't claim that, oh no, conflicts of interest isn't CNN, and so therefore Kyle Anzalone doesn't have a First Amendment. I have a First Amendment, Julian Assange has a First Amendment, and also now he's shining a light on prison conditions. So many more people are talking about SAMs that have existed forever, the Communications Management Unit, ADS Florence, and the horrific way people are treated in U.S. prisons, especially people with mental health issues. If it wasn't for, Assange going through what he's going through, it wouldn't be talked about so much. And so, while Assange is suffering, and there's not really good coming from it, but maybe shining a light on some problems that really need to be discussed, and then maybe we could make some good happen from there. Now let's talk about China and this hypersonic weapons test. And I really wanted to take some time before I start and weighed in on it because I know people are making such a huge deal about it. Start. It didn't seem like as huge of a deal to me. And I think there's a really great piece here by Moon of Alabama titled "Pentagon Generals, News Writers Abuse Chinese Test Flights to Argue for More Weapons," where he goes and explains what actually happened here. And so while I guess maybe there was a technical step forward here for China from what they tested, it wasn't anywhere near as significant as claimed, and also wasn't some new crazy revolutionary technology. I mean, we have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, actually saying that this was a Sputnik moment. For people who maybe don't know, apparently, I think it's 57 when the Russians launched their first satellite into orbit. The U.S. had no idea Russia even remotely had, or I guess the USSR, the Soviets, even remotely had that technology. And so that was supposed to be a big, surprise and everything like that. Now, from General Mark Milley's perspective, this should be seen as an admission of failure, right? Like when Congress heard that, they shouldn't be like, "Oh no, General, what do we now do?" They say, "General, what is wrong with you? You are, you're the head of the military, and you're telling me that you guys can't figure out that China is testing hypersonic missiles? How could we possibly be this surprised?" And also, where are you tendering your resignation letter? Because this is absolutely unacceptable. Same thing for the CIA. How they could possibly be surprised of Chinese hypersonic missile abilities and tests is unbelievable and ridiculous. Also, when you look at, and this was made in the New York Times article by David Sanger that, was the big to-do about this whole thing, that there were 2 tests over the summer of Chinese hypersonic missiles. So it was completely ridiculous that this was like a big surprise or everything like that. And that's one of the first propaganda lines you have here. The next one is essentially what this is a vehicle that could be launched into low orbit, or orbit, I guess, and then be maneuvered and brought down somewhere on Earth, right, at hypersonic speeds, so speeds at 5 times the speed of sound. That's the alleged technology that China has developed here. And so, as Moon of Alabama Law points out, it really doesn't make sense to say that this in some way really shifts or makes a major change to maybe China having first strike ability, the U.S. having a first strike ability, or anything like that. The U.S. ground-based missile defense systems that are housed in Alaska and California, they actually don't even have enough to shoot down all the Chinese missiles should they set them off. So even, let's say, all of our ground-based missile defense systems go 100 for 100, all of them take out the Chinese missiles that are launched. Guess what? China still has enough missiles and nukes to hit U.S. cities. So this really doesn't change a whole lot in the calculation there. Also, the big problem is the U.S. Missile defense systems are nowhere near as accurate as they claim. So, of course, things could are and definitely would get through if if China did launch their intercontinental ballistic missiles at the United States, the ICBMs. And so this really doesn't make a major change in the nuclear balance between the U.S. and China. And then, of course, the big thing that he points out is this really isn't technology that's beyond the U.S. space shuttle program, right? If the U.S. really wanted to, they could strap a nuke into one of those things and, deploy it somewhere on Earth, and those things could travel very quickly. Now, of course, they've been phased out and everything like that, but this is obviously technology that the U.S. has and could develop, and isn't all that much different than technology that the Soviets actually looked at developing in the 1960s with the fractional orbital bombardment system. And this is just a part of evolving nuclear technology, of course, but it's not a major step forward, or it's not a major shift in the balance of power or anything like that. What this is it's a propaganda tool being used by the Biden administration and the military industrial complex, as highlighted in the Moon of Alabama. And this is kind of where I'll wrap up my talk on this, is they say that the Chinese test may well form the basis of a new arms race at the very moment that President Biden has been looking for ways to avoid a proposed $1 trillion modernization of the American nuclear forces and delivery systems. And so what this is saying is, Biden maybe isn't looking to go full blast into this multi-trillion-dollar spending on nuclear weapons. We have this happen. It's now what the Hawks are going to use to say, Mr. President, we have to spend all this money. Or, you'll even have the lunatics out there like Ted Cruz or Tom Cotton, even maybe some Democrats, I'm sure Liz Cheney will all go, oh, the president is owned by China. Look, they're developing new missile technology and he's cutting the budget for the U.S. military, even though we outspend China on military like 4 or 5 to 1 or something absurd like that. So, this is being made a big story in the media. I've even seen a lot of libertarians talk about like China is making some major developments and that we should be worried about the Chinese threat. That I really don't think that's the case. Now, one thing that seems to me to be a pretty clear indication that this is the case is the CIA has recently opened a new center focused on China. And so if the US was really surprised by a Sputnik moment, right? Completely out of the blue, China develops a new technology. We can't even believe they have it. We don't know how to do it. Oh my God, isn't this scary? Then why the hell is the CIA new anti-China task force center more concerned about Taiwan than the Chinese hypersonic weapons? I think that's that's pretty much all you need to know here. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, October 26th. Taiwan is a top issue for the CIA's new China Center, and the head of that, or I guess the CIA Deputy Director David Cohen, said that China will be the number one issues. And that's the focus there for Taiwan. Very interesting, and I think a major problem for kind of the narrative that hypersonics are what we all should be worried about when it comes to China. The CIA doesn't seem to have it even as the top priority. especially if there's, the intelligence failure that's involved. Of course, again, no concern with the CIA on China, right? They have this brand new technology, apparently. You would think heads should be rolling there, but nobody is even remotely interested in any reevaluation. Now, we also have the FBI involved in an anti-China effort. This, again, Dave DeCamp. The FBI asks U.S. businesses to work with the FBI closely to counter China. FBI Director Christopher Wray, Dave writes, urged private companies Tuesday to work with the agencies to counter China and prevent the Asian country from becoming the world's only superpower. That's right. China is going to apparently steal enough American intellectual property, and that is going to make them the number one, not only the number one, but the only world superpower. This is just completely absurd. Look, IP shouldn't even exist, and it's completely ridiculous. Now, I'm not saying that there's no like Chinese hacking or that like cyber espionage. Of course, all that stuff does happen. China, I guess, at least manufacturers in China, I guess I've read enough articles that I feel pretty comfortable with this. They make a lot of counterfeit stuff. Happens. They sell it to other countries and stuff, but this is the market at work, and a whole bunch. Like if a Chinese company is able to make an iPhone a hell of a lot cheaper, then that just gives more people in the world access to the iPhone, right? So this isn't necessarily a bad thing, and not something that's going to displace America as being the number one superpower. I think the FBI and helping like the Clinton campaign funnel Russiagate conspiracy theories into the U.S. mainstream does far more damage to the United States than any China looking at our IP or stealing our IP or anything like that. So we have some clarification now on U.S. troops training Taiwanese troops. This actually comes from Taiwan's president, who is a part of the pro-independence party. And so anytime you hear something that the Taiwanese president is doing, you may want to consider if their effort is actually to sow more division between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. That way, the U.S. puts more security, guarantees more protections of Taiwan, which will allow Taiwan to declare more independence and be more overt about their separation from China. And so she confirmed that there's a small number of U.S., I think, special forces training Taiwanese forces. Now, this was well known. I'm sure China had enough espionage and surveillance capabilities to be aware that this was going on. But the public admission by Taiwan's president has provoked China to say that, Washington really needs to abide by the one China policy that was agreed on in the 70s, where, we say that China is one state, and that includes Taiwan, even though the U.S. will support Taiwan defense. That's not supposed to be overt or anything like that. And so it's violation on the one China policy to had the U.S. training like this, and that's why China is even more upset. And I'm sure this is going to provoke China to probably maybe put more military assets across the Taiwan Strait. They're going to carry out more flights in Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Of course, on the show several times I've explained how this is very different from Taiwanese airspace, and so that's something important to remember. We have one important statement from Taiwan's defense minister that I wanted to bring up, and that is, he said the island should rely on itself for defense, and that there was relying on faith that the U.S. would intervene in the case of a Chinese invasion. And I think this is maybe something that the Taiwanese should realize, that while the U.S. politicians, Joe Biden, etc., the whole military industrial complex is absolutely on board with the U.S. defending Taiwan against a Chinese invasion because they don't see that invasion happening. They think they would win if it would happen, and they think that they'll get to sell Taiwan and develop a whole bunch of new weapon systems and rape the American people for trillions of dollars over this perceived threat of China invading Taiwan. What they don't realize is that the American people, even no matter what polling shows, I really don't think the American people, when they look at a map where they realize where Taiwan is and how much it would cost, how many American soldiers would end up dying for it, I don't think that they're really going to send a whole generation of their sons to Taiwan, sons and daughters now, to Taiwan to be killed to defend Taiwan, especially when it's so clear that if, a war really did break out, maybe in a temporary sense, but in the long term, there really wasn't anything the U.S. could do to repel an invasion of Taiwan. And so with that, another fruitless war, the American people don't want it. And so while our politicians will talk tough on our behalf, when the time comes that the American people are enough against it, depending on how the politics are playing out at the time, maybe we actually don't come to Taiwan's defense, and that could put Taiwan in a position where they really get militarily wrecked by China. And so that is probably a smart calculation for the Taiwanese defense minister to consider. Also, something interesting that I read recently by Daniel L. Davis, the retired lieutenant colonel, is that Taiwan is actually they don't staff their military completely. Like only 60% of their positions along their shoreline and stuff actually have soldiers and stuff there because they can't fill the ranks. And so you would think if there's all this existential dread in Taiwan of a Chinese invasion, people would be willing to, fight for their homeland. And it just doesn't seem like they have a whole lot of people lining up to join their army and military to do so. Makes you question how much of a threat that's actually perceived by the people in Taiwan and how much they really want to fight here. Maybe it's a situation like in the Middle East, they're interested in fighting the Chinese to the last American. All right, now Biden attended the the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN Summit. It was a virtual event, and there, while this was in Southeast Asia event, whereas China, Southeast Asia, and, there's a Chinese representative there. The U.S. and Biden took this opportunity to say they were deeply concerned by China's coercive actions in the region, and also said the U.S. is committed to Taiwan. In fact, the commitment is rock solid and consistent across administrations. It continues to be the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and within the region. And if Joe Biden really believes what he's saying here, it's a huge miscalculation. It was the policy of strategic ambiguity, the one China policy that for decades has maintained the peace. However, by saying that the U.S. is committed to defend Taiwan, it is breaking that policy. It is breaking the decades-long policy that has held the peace. And it's a delicate piece to say that when there's a military buildup on each side of the thing, and provocative like weapon sales from the U.S. to Taiwan, stuff like it hasn't been a perfect peace for all these years or anything like that. However, it's not like the U.S. has maintained a consistent policy either under Obama when we started our pivot to Asia, but it escalated the anti-China hostilities under Trump, and especially the support for Taiwan, more diplomatic ties, more weapons support. And then this has really accelerated even more under the Biden administration with more crossing of the Taiwan Strait, the new agreement with the UK and Australia to provide nuclear power submarines to Australia. And more traversing of the Taiwan Strait. And according to China, they say there's been 2,000 U.S. spy missions close to China in the past year. So all this very disturbing, very provocative towards China. Let's see. One more thing to talk about here And that again, this from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Blinken raises China tensions with calls for Taiwan to participate more in UN. Secretary of State Antony Blinken writes, Dave, increased tensions with China over Taiwan Tuesday when he called for UN member states to support Taipei's robust participation in the UN system. And so this is one of the complicated things about the US having a one China policy, because if there's one China, that means there's one China government. And honestly, if there is a China government, it is the government in Beijing, right? This is just like kind of as a matter of fact, if you look at things, how it kind of should be by the way the US sets up this policy. Now, it does create some struggles for Taiwan and for the Taiwanese people. That is unfair. It is, like diplomatic warfare by China against Taiwan to some extent, right? Isolating them from the WHO during the pandemic, stuff like that. I'm not endorsing all these Chinese actions or saying that it's great to isolate, Taiwan from all these international bodies, but it is a part of the one China policy that the U.S. has maintained. And this is the U.S., another example of it, breaking and walking away from that policy. And we need to understand there's going to be reactions from China because of that. And so I think the U.S. is increasingly putting itself in a position where Taiwan, where we are going to start to build up militarily, which is going to cause the Chinese reaction to build up militarily. And then we can never withdraw or de-escalate from that military because now China has additional military capabilities. And in fact, it's going to be an escalatory cycle over time. This is a dangerous position that the U.S. is putting itself in. Now, it seems really unlikely to me that China or Taiwan would ever really launch a war against each other. Peter Van Buren, who was a diplomat in the region for decades, explains this, I think, very well and makes very important points here. But at the same time, we recently had the USS Connecticut, which is a nuclear-powered spy sub, run into something in the South China Sea. So the more activity you have, the more risk you have of accidents leading to escalations. Also, even if it doesn't actually put like a war between US and not the US, Taiwan and China, kick off something like that, the more military assets the US puts in the region, the more likely it is that we end up with some kind of skirmish in China, because we don't have the deep, long cultural ties that the people of Taiwan and China have with each other. All right. I will move on now, and I want to just highlight this story that I think is very important on Havana syndrome. Of course, this is something that I've been talking about a lot on the show. I think it's a really important issue. I have made very clear that I think this is essentially an entirely fake narrative that is being put out by the U.S. deep state to demonize and destroy relations with essentially any country they choose, whether it be Iran, Russia, China, or Cuba. And this Havana syndrome is basically just a mass psychosis type situation. And so, to further fuel this mass psychosis, the U.S. recently passed the Havana Act, which is going to make it more likely that they're going to generate these cases. But now, Senator Susan Collins, who was the main sponsor of the Havana Act, by the way, put something in the Defense Appropriations Bill, the NDAA for 2022, the Senate version of it, to give assistance to U.S. officials that get Havana syndrome. So imagine this. Imagine if you have a fake illness that's actually just psychosomatic, right? And now you're going to start paying people to say, oh yeah, all my symptoms line up with Havana syndrome. I can't work no more. Give me a paycheck forever. That's what the U.S. is doing, generating cases. That is all they're doing here. They're generating propaganda with this, and they're doing it at our expense. I cannot wait until we get rid of Susan Collins. And I don't know why, but she seems to be the person that right now is the main driver of the legislation for Havana syndrome in the Senate. Something to keep an eye on. I don't believe that this was in the House version, and so if the Senate does pass this will be a conference committee issue. All right, before I wrap up today, got a few stories on Israel that I want to talk about. The first one is Israel has set up a office at CENTCOM. This is CENTCOM's offices are in Florida, by the way, and this is a part of the adjusting of Israel from Eurocom. So the U.S. has all these commands: Northcom, Southcom, Eurocom. A special command for joint operations that they break up different areas of the world. So there's an Africa command, there's CENTCOM, which is the Middle East, and now Israel is considered to be a part of the geographic area of CENTCOM. One of the reasons I think this is important is Israel has effectively undermined all the attempts at U.S. diplomacy, no matter how weak they have been during the Biden administration, to revive the JCPOA. And so if Israel is involved in what's happening in Central Command, they could either exploit with their knowledge or influence and steer the U.S. towards a more militarily aggressive position against either Iran or what the U.S. and Israel at least view as its allied forces in the region, whether they are actually not, but maybe carrying out attacks against Shia militias in Iraq or Syria, targeting Hezbollah or something like that. And actually, in fact, we did see this week as a potential to restart talks in Vienna to save the Iran nuclear deal. We actually just got an announcement from the U.S. Treasury that the U.S. was sanctioning 2 members of the IRGC and 2 companies tied to those 2 members of the IRGC. And this is going to, I guess, be a sign to Iran that the U.S. really isn't interested in diplomacy at this time. What they want is more economic warfare. But moving back on to Israel issues, Israel announced this week that they're going to build 3,000 new settler homes in the West Bank. So, of course, Palestinians can never get a building permit to even fix their homes and have to live in cages. But they're going to build a bunch of real nice apartments and homes in the West Bank, next to poor, homeless Palestinians. They will, build roads between settlements that the Palestinians aren't allowed to travel on. And what the U.S. has to say about this is, we're deeply concerned about the Israel's government's plan to advance thousands of settlement units tomorrow, Wednesday, many of them deep in the West Bank. Well, that sounds like, oh man, they're really against it. And then we say, but we're not going to change any of the billions of dollars of military aid that we give to Israel every year. We're not considering in any way changing any of the financial ties or relationships that we have. And in fact, what we get from, and this isn't the U.S. government, but the New York state government, is because Ben & Jerry's is no longer going to sell ice cream to settlers in the West Bank who are intricate parts of Israel's apartheid system against the Palestinians. They say, you know what? If you're a settler, you have to drive to Israel proper to buy your ice cream. We're not going to sell it in the West Bank settlements. And guess what? They're throwing an absolute fit, the Israel lobby, and now New York is activating its I guess they don't have anti-BDS legislation. Sorry, but anyway, even with that, they will divest from the state's pension fund $111 million in stock of Ben & Jerry's parent company Unilever. So that's something to talk about, and something very important that is happening as well. Probably the most egregious things, though, that Israel is doing to the Palestinians right now is recently naming 6 Palestinian rights organizations. Actually, to call them Palestinian rights organizations is a little bit misleading. They're human rights groups, and some of them are, just Palestinian based, but some of them are just, human rights groups. Al-Haq, Defense of Children International, and then the Palestinian branch, the Bison Center for Research and Development, the Palestinian Women's Committee for Unity, and then like an agricultural group. There's 6 of these in total. They're making these groups legal, labeling them as terrorist organizations. And basically, the best I could tell, the only thing Israel could actually say to label these groups as terrorist organizations is that they expose the Israeli war crimes committed against the Palestinians. And in doing so, people are so disgusted by the crimes that Israel is committing against Palestine, people turn against Israel. That's the best I could find, but that is, of course, the problem of the world criminals, and not the problem of the people exposing the war crimes. And so it's just another disgusting step that Israel has taken towards apartheid. But maybe the most obvious one is the destruction of the Palestinian cemetery. There was recent video I saw of what people claim to be a Palestinian mother over the grave of her son, as Israeli soldiers were dragging her away, and you could see a bulldozer in the background. Now, I could not confirm myself that that was a current video or that it was involved with this cemetery. So I just wanted to make that clear, because I see a lot of people sharing that video and talking about it. Couldn't verify that that was actually something that was happening right now. However, I did see people saying that definitely was a Palestinian woman, and that definitely was a Palestinian cemetery. So at some point you did, and I didn't see the grave destroyed. So at some point you did at the very least have soldiers dragging a Palestinian mother off of the grave of her son. That's what you could see in that video. But what you can see here is confirmed to be Israel destroying, taking apart a cemetery that is Palestinian, to build a biblical park, I think is what they're calling it. I see some people labeling it an amusement park, some people labeling as a biblical amusement park, or sometimes just a biblical park. So I don't want to mislead people if they think, that they're burying, they're digging up the graves to build such flags, when really it's just going to be an arboretum with some scripture or something like that. I'm not exactly sure what's going up here, but they are destroying a Palestinian cemetery, and that's just about as horrific and nasty as you could absolutely be. And any defense of this that I've seen is just, no, it's not as bad as what they're saying. They're not going to build a Six Flags, but it's still pretty bad if you're digging up a cemetery. It's a pretty clear side that, you are part of an apartheid state. Now, last thing I have here is a great article from Middle East Eye explaining how the population of Gaza is slowly being poisoned by their own water. Water damage studies show that 25% of the people in Gaza who get sick are being poisoned by their own polluted water. And so there's a lot of reasons for this that are outlined in the article. If you're interested, I recommend going through it. But just some of the highlights are that one of the things that happens is when Israel, say, bombs a street in Gaza City, you don't see it, but under that street, if there's any kind of like sewage piping or something like that, it gets damaged. They don't have the infrastructure or equipment to go dig it up, repair it, and everything. And so even if it's just a little bit, the sewage starts to seeps into the groundwater, poisons the groundwater. Now you have, everybody's poop and piss and everything, and everybody's drinking water. This is the situation that the people of Gaza live under because of the Israeli government. And that is just, it's absolutely horrible. There's no other way to say it. I mean, how to describe what happens to, a population that only has a few hours of power a day. So they can't run their desalination plants, their water purification plants enough. And so some little kid is drinking dirty water and, possibly then succumbing to what he has, but also even, just being sick for weeds, more stunted development, all that kind of stuff plays into effect when kids are malnourished from, constantly being ill from their drinking water. Another thing that this article highlights is some of the impact that the pandemic has had, particularly on Gaza, not necessarily in the high number of COVID cases, but just how much more crackdown that there has been on people being able to get in and out, goods getting in and out of Gaza, and just increasing the suffering. So that's what it is. You have a state with, a universal education, healthcare system, F-35s in their military. It's an absolute, you go to Tel Aviv. I haven't been to Tel Aviv, but talk to people who have been there. I've also seen pictures. Seems like a pretty modern city, right? And then just, a few, I guess, scores a mile away, you have some of the most impoverished people on the planet who can't even get clean drinking water. And that, the U.S. is more concerned about supporting and giving aid, billions of dollars of military aid for the Israelis to continue to do that to the Palestinians, rather than supporting the Palestinians in their suffering. All right, that's what I'll wrap up for today. I want to talk about the Kun Sudan, but I'll get to that next show and a whole bunch of other stuff. A ton of great content coming up this week. Everybody, be sure to share the show, find it at the Libertarian Institute, and support our fund drive that we got going on right now. Thanks, everybody.